Tipping culture around Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and rideshare drivers in general is one of the most unique tipping cultures of any profession I've ever seen. And I think there's a few different reasons as to why. And in this video, I really want to break it down because I've seen so many comments on this channel. I've interviewed so many drivers talking about it, and some drivers love the way tipping works around Uber and Lyft. They get great tips. Other drivers are like, no, I get horrible tips. People are rude, etc., etc. And I think there are mainly two different reasons I find as to why tipping culture is just so different when it comes to Uber and Lyft. One, I find is really the get-go of Uber's and Lyft's policies. And the second is the removal of the social pressure when it comes to tipping. In this video, I'm gonna make it a very kind of fireside chat style video. I do these every once in a while, very raw, unedited style video, just kind of giving my thoughts. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing, I think the biggest reason, if I had to pinpoint one, is really the get-go of Uber and Lyft. In case you didn't know, I started driving at the end of 2014-ish. And I remember when I first started driving, they had very strict rules saying, hey, you do not accept tips. If somebody asks you, here's kind of the three-step process. If somebody asks you to tip, saying, hey, let me give you a tip, or they suggest it or whatever, you say no. If they ask you a second time, you say, no, just letting you know, we do not do tips. We don't accept tips. If somebody asks you a third time and they insist, then you say, you know what? We don't accept tips, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much. So there's a three-step process just to get that extra, $5 or $10 or whatever. And I think to a lot of drivers, they think, oh, well, it's making it cheaper, right? It's making the ride cheaper. As we all know, tipping makes anything more expensive. And especially right now in this day and age, we all probably have seen those memes now of someone paying a bill about something and that person turns that tablet around and it says choose 20, 25, or 30% as your tip. I just went to a concert recently, ironically, went to the door, and it was one of those concerts where it's like a low-key EDM event. So you just kind of pay $5, $10, or $15 at the door, that kind of thing. And when I paid the $5, the person turned the tablet around saying, oh, do you want to tip the place? And I'm like, the tip doesn't go to the artist, which in that case, maybe I'd be more likely to because I want to support live music. But it was just, I just tip the bouncer? I don't know. Tipping culture is getting very weird, as we all know. I feel like seeing that tablet being turned around is everywhere. But I digress. And when it comes to Uber and Lyft, it is very, very interesting that when it comes to that, it's not about making it more expensive. It's not that or less expensive or whatever. It's the fact that for Uber and Lyft, they wanted it to be a cashless transaction. They want to remove the oddity, if that's the right word, of, let's say, a taxi pulling over. They're like, cash or card, and then you have to maybe get change. You ask for a certain amount of money back. You want to make sure you're calculating in the tip. Or let's say you take your card and you have to put it in and you're just sitting there waiting. They want to remove that whole thing. They almost want to act like it's like a unique magic trick where something is happening behind the scenes and you know what's happening behind the scenes, but you don't talk about it. You don't act like it's existing. That's the biggest thing. And if I think about it, it's true that Uber and Lyft was one of the first, or ride sharing in general, was one of the first big professions that really made everything completely cashless. We didn't see the transaction happening while the service is taking place, whether it's before or after. You pay before you even get in the car, or you set up your credit card or bank account before you even get in the vehicle, and then you get dropped off, and it's like nothing ever took place. That is the biggest reason why, right? And I just did a video about this yesterday, actually talking about why so many drivers are quitting, and I think a big part of that, among, of course, the lack of pay and all these different things, is that tipping is just not that common. And I think, unfortunately, even though now, of course, tipping is something that happens right on the Uber and Lyft apps. When you drop somebody off, or let's say as a passenger, when I get out of that Uber or Lyft, immediately on my phone it says rating and tip. But I think the problem is because Uber and Lyft created this whole methodology of saying, look, you don't tip your Uber drivers, you don't tip your Lyft drivers, I think that still, unfortunately, is prevailing in this day and age, right? And it's very unfortunate to say. For me, as I'd almost consider myself an old school Uber and Lyft driver, because I started fairly early on, right? It's funny that if I were to drive now and I were to get a tip, I'd be flabbergasted. And again, I mentioned this in yesterday's video. I'd be flabbergasted. I'd be like, oh my God, I got a tip through the app. Somebody tipped. Like, I'd be blown away. However, maybe a new school Uber and Lyft driver would have the same reaction if they didn't get tipped. They're like, wait, I just did a huge 30-minute ride. Oh, we had a great conversation. I pulled over and they ran into 7-Eleven to grab a Gatorade real quick. I don't know, and they didn't tip me at all. They'd be flabbergasted. So it's funny that my reaction as an old school driver getting a tip is the same reaction for a new school driver not getting a tip. And I think, unfortunately, I think that the old school methodology, like I said, of Uber and Lyft stating you don't tip, still is prevailing. I do think it's changing, being honest. I think that now, especially given the GUI or the graphical user interface of the Uber and Lyft apps, they're making it very apparent saying, hey, tip your drivers, tip your drivers. It's very important. So I do think that is changing. And I think over time, tipping your rideshare drivers is becoming more popular. And in addition, I mean, and then this has a big thing to do with it too, that people are now understanding like, wow, rideshare drivers don't get paid that much at all. Pay's been unfortunately decreasing for a lot of rideshare drivers. And like I mentioned in the video yesterday, talking about why a lot of drivers are quitting, expenses are going up. Gas is more expensive. Maintenance on your car is more expensive. Even like say, if you live here in LA, which is where I live, you kind of have to get car washes as an Uber and Lyft driver. A huge pro tip I've mentioned in other videos is that if you think about it, the first impression somebody has of you, which is very kind of not thought about or kind of underrated, is the outside of your vehicle. Not how clean it is on the inside, not the smell, which of course is very important, not the smell on the inside, but the outside of your vehicle. Even if everything inside is spotless, first impressions, unfortunately, they've done studies, have a huge impact, as we all know. And if someone's approaching your car and there's a bunch of dust on the outside or whatever, well, that's gonna be a bad impression. Here in LA, it barely ever rains. It's not like Boston, where in Boston, I never got a car wash. Here, I do have to get a good amount of car washes. And the car washes themselves, I remember when I first got here, were like $6, maybe $5 or whatever. Now they're like $12 or $13. It starts to add up, right? So with drivers being paid way less and with costs going up, I think people are understanding, very similar to a waiter or waitress, like, wow, a good amount of their money, unfortunately, has to come from tips and everything. I think it's a bit of a part of it. And so I think, luckily now, tipping has been getting a bit better with most drivers out there. And I think that is very, very important, right? That old school methodology, even though I think it still kind of is prevailing, and stuff like that, I think it is slowly changing. And I think that's important. Now, the second thing, though, and I think this is not necessarily an old school versus new school thing, but I think just the nature and the unfortunate inevitability of the way tipping works with Uber and Lyft is the removal of social pressure, right? Now, they have done studies, and it's probably not surprising, that when people take that tablet, like I mentioned earlier, and this is very important for this, and they spin it around to you, let's be honest. If you, let's say, went to a deli and you ordered a sandwich, typically, I think most people probably wouldn't tip. If you're going just to pick it up and they make it right in front of you, like Subway, for example, like it's a mom and pop sandwich place, and you get a sandwich or whatever, like a ham and cheese sandwich with stuff on it. Normally, I think most people wouldn't tip, right? Like something like that, you probably just go, you give them $10 or whatever it is for the sandwich, you leave, that's it. However, with a lot of systems adopting that tablet system, and I will say, I don't think it's necessarily all of the business's fault. I think a lot of it is just the nature of the programming of it. So let's say if you go to get that sandwich now, they flip that tablet around and it says 15, 20, or 25%, for example. More people now are likely to tip given the social pressure. The person flips it around, they kind of stand there like this, and they look at you, and you're like, I mean, I'm just getting bread with ham and cheese. I guess I'll tip. I don't know. I'll give them 20%. I don't know, right? And there's even a bunch of memes I've seen about it that, like, say, when you go to pay your landlord now, they're going to flip a tablet around and stuff like that. And so there is that social pressure that right in front of you for things that maybe normally you wouldn't tip on, now you are tipping on. And granted, I think there is a debate to this, right? I mean, whole other subject for a whole other video, but I think some things are justified. I think there are some places where if they do go above and beyond, yeah, I don't mind giving maybe a tip to something maybe normally I wouldn't tip on. On the other end, and I think we can all agree here, there are some situations where I'm like, why would I ever give you a tip? Like going to that concert, like I said, where I'm like, the tip doesn't go to the artist, which I'd be way more likely to tip. It goes to the person sitting there giving me my ticket because I don't know. Like, it's getting a little ridiculous, right? And I think we can all agree when it comes to that. But I think the big reason why a lot of people tip, not only when it comes to that tablet being spun around, but like say in a bar, if you're getting a waiter waitress, of course, the service is a big thing. It's kind of the standard practice, but also the social pressure. Now, relaying that all the way back to Uber and Lyft, if you think about it, it's not like a taxi. It's not like that when you leave, you and the taxi driver are done. You theoretically will never see each other ever again. There's no interactive communication between you guys. There's no way to communicate. That's pretty much it. It's a done deal. So as you think about it, when you tip, like say the taxi driver, you put your card, like say in the slot, or you do it with cash. If you tip 15 or 20%, they're right there. So if you don't tip, it might be a bit awkward. They might confront you, and they probably will. Same thing with a lot of bartenders, same thing with a lot of waitress and waiters. If you think about it, when it comes to delivery driving, you tip before it even gets there. I've already done a video about, let's say, the tipping culture on delivery driving, because it is very unique too. It's really the only industry, I think, in the entire world, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you tip before the thing even takes place. I've had really, really good delivery drivers that deserve their tip, but I'll be honest, I've actually had bad delivery drivers, right? Remember, no one's perfect. I've had bad delivery drivers. I'm like, great, I tipped them pretty well, and yet they still screwed up my order completely, where it was flipped on top. It was a huge mess. They forgot the milkshake. I don't know. But anyway, digressing now to Uber and Lyft and ride sharing, if you think about it, with all those other industries, there is that social pressure. With Uber and Lyft, though, most people, almost everybody, tips after the interaction happened. Meaning, I think to a lot of people, the driver drives away, they say, oh, cool, and they put their phone in their pocket. I've even seen, and it's been decently common, that a good amount of people don't even really rate their drivers as much. I think to a lot of people, they get out of the car and they go. I think this could also be attributed to alcohol and stuff like that, but then again, people still tip their bartenders. So it is really tough to say exactly, but I think that is a huge thing. It's not like the Uber and Lyft driver says, hey, you can only tip me while the ride's happening. Now that would be more interesting if it was like a taxi where, let's say they pull off and let's say they're like, hey, thank you so much for the ride, and you know that you can only tip before you leave the vehicle. I think that would increase tips because people would be like, sure, I'm going to tip you. And I'm not saying people are super stingy or rude or stuff like that, but I think for a lot of people, I think they just, do not think of ride sharing being a tipping thing. Being honest, and I know it's unfortunate to say, I know a lot of drivers watch this and be like, no, we should be tipped, and I agree. But if you think about it, because of that old school methodology, like I said earlier, I think a lot of people just don't look at ride sharing as something you tip. I think people are still used to, in a sense, that old school mentality that tipping is just not as common. You always tip your bartenders. You always tip your waiters or waitresses. But ride sharing, I don't know, right? And I think also too, the fact that that tip has to happen when you leave the vehicle, I think for a lot of people too, even though, yeah, on the app it does say like tip or whatever, you can quickly go back into the app. You can quickly go back and do X, Y, or Z. I think it does make it, I think it'd be kind of cool if, let's say, Uber and Lyft, and again, it's tough to say the exact solution to this, right? I think it would be cool if Uber and Lyft said, hey, let's say you tip, you rate your driver, and under that says a tip. Let's say you go to X out that window, right? It would be kind of cool maybe Uber and Lyft have things saying, hey, we noticed you did not tip your driver. Remember, 100% of tips go to drivers, and always tip your rideshare drivers. Then maybe there could be two options, right? Saying, yes, please take me back to tip, or no, I'm all set. You could do that, but like I said, I think for a lot of people, because the rideshare driver's not there, because it's not like they're gonna get any blowback, so to speak, I think because of not even just the social pressure of tipping, but the potential negative consequences, they just don't really exist, right? It's not like in a bar, if you don't tip your bartender, let's say you rack up $100 tab, you're sitting at a bar, and you say, hey, thanks, man, and they give you that tip thing, and you just cross out the tip sign or put 0, and you hand it to them and you go to leave, the bartender probably be like, hey, man, you racked up $100 worth of drinks of all these mixed drinks I made you, these craft drinks, and you're not gonna tip me. Like, not only is there social pressure to tip, but you know there's a potential negative consequence of that. I've seen some waiters or waitresses confront people. You can argue if this is right or wrong. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, right? I can see the debate on both sides. I've seen waiters and waitresses go up to people saying, hey, I'm just curious. I saw you tip me 5% on my bill. The standard or the average is minimum 15%. I think now it's almost 20%. Can you tell me what's going on? So you know there's gonna be a negative consequence, right? Same thing with delivery driving. If you don't tip in the beginning, you know that your food's probably gonna be heavily mishandled, and you could argue if that's good or bad, but that's another big thing, right? With rideshare driving though, and I know this could be debated, but I have to be honest, I don't think there's really any huge negative consequence for the non-tipper, right? You don't have to worry about any negative consequence of people around you being like, oh, what a cheap person, or what a cheap, or whatever, right? Like, you don't really have to worry about any of that. And I think that is the reason why I think a lot of people feel like they can get away with not tipping. They're like, I'm not gonna get any social pressure initially when it comes to the tip, right? And in addition, I'm not gonna get any potential negative blowback after I don't tip. Why would I tip? And I think, and granted, yes, I think right now, of course, the economy is not doing well. So a lot of people are like, hey, tipping just makes your ride more expensive. If I take a Lyft to Uber, this like say $20, right, to go to wherever. If let's say I'm gonna tip 20% on that, that means my ride actually isn't 20, it's technically 24, right? And yes, you could argue that yes, it's only $4 more, but that's a huge thing. And I think that's where I think tipping culture right now in ride sharing is such in a very unique place. That one, like I said, that old school methodology, which I will say is changing. I think over time, it's getting more and more common to tip. I do say that, and I think that is very important. And I think it also depends, and I've done videos about this, about your vehicle too. I've done videos about how they did studies. And they find people, for example, are more likely to tip if, let's say, you have a Tesla or a nice vehicle than not. And it could be maybe because you're dealing with a more maybe higher end clientele in terms of how much money they're making. That's definitely, I think, a huge part of it. It could also be that maybe those people are ordering these luxury rides. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, if you're doing a luxury ride, of course, you always tip on a black car, right? As opposed to, like, say, a normal Honda Civic, for example. So there are some different aspects to the whole tipping culture in general, especially given the types of rides people are taking. And of course, the type of vehicle you have. There's a lot of different factors to it. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing, like I said, is the old school methodology, which is changing, but also too, there's no social pressure and there's no negative blowback if you don't tip, right? I mean, I think the worst that could potentially happen, if I had to really think super hard about this, is like, say, one of your friends saying, hey, did you tip that guy or girl? They were really nice. And you're like, oh no. And then you're like, really? You didn't tip your driver? Like, I think that's the most negative thing that can potentially happen in terms of that blowback. And not saying that it has to be this negative potential consequence to force people to tip, but I think we can all agree rideshare drivers deserve to get tips just like every other service industry. I'm not sure exactly what the solution is. And I do think that over time, like I said, I think tipping culture is getting more and more prevalent with rideshare drivers, but it still has a long way to go.